So welcome everyone to today's session of the SMaRT seminar series, which is jointly organized by the John Hopkins University and IIT Delhi. So here the intention is that we want to bring together leading voices in scientific machine learning, physics-based AI and AI for science and mechanics. And today it's a special privilege to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Agnimitra Dasgupta, who is currently the John von Neumann Fellow at Sandia National Laboratories. Just so you know, this fellowship, which is John von Neumann Fellowship, is an exceptionally prestigious fellowship awarded to only a very selected few researchers worldwide. So prior to this, he had done a postdoc at the University of Southern California with Professor Asad Oberoi, and he also earned his PhD in civil engineering from University of Southern California in 2023, where he was supported by the Provost's PhD fellowship. His background also includes degrees from Jadavpur University and the Indian Institute of Science. And his research sits at the intersection of computational mechanics, uncertainty quantification, and generative AI. Today, Dr. Dasgupta will be speaking on diffusion models for scientific machine learning. With that, I extend a very warm welcome to Dr. Agnimitra Dasgupta. Thank you for giving us your time for this talk. The virtual floor is now yours.
I hope I'm audible and everyone can see my slides. So good morning, everyone, and depending on which part of the world you are, good evening. And thank you for the warm introduction, Professor Nayak. It's really a pleasure to be here. And as you rightly said, so my hope today is to sort of highlight some of the work we've been doing over the past 2 years on diffusion models. And before I begin, I just want to contextualize my talk a little bit. So I'm interested in solving problems related to uncertainty quantification. As you may or may not know, UQ gets really hard if you're looking at sort of, problems that involve black box systems that are computationally expensive. And if you have to do uncertainty quantification in really high dimensional or high stochastic dimensionality, right? So dealing with that becomes really problematic. It's a challenge. And one of the ways that we think that you can sort of address this challenge is by leveraging sort of generative models, which currently underpin a lot of the generative AI that seems to surround us on a day-to-day basis. And in particular, we've been looking at diffusion models and flow matching models. And today what I'm going to do is sort of try and present a rather interesting perspective on diffusion models in particular, and really analyze them from the lens of PDEs, and then finally analyze their behavior as dynamical systems. So that's the hope for today, right? And so the way I've structured the talk today is as follows. So I want to briefly introduce what diffusion models are, sort of lay the land a little bit, provide the PDE perspective, as I said, look at some applications with particular emphasis on inverse problems, because that's what we've been interested in, look at aspects of memorization and regularization, and sort of highlight sort of some interesting future directions that are popping up. Now, most of my talk is sort of based on the following 3 papers. The first paper is published in CMME. It was accepted last year. I think the publication date is sometime early this year. The second paper is currently in review at CMME. We've had the first round of reviews. We're still waiting on a final decision on the paper. And the third paper, and which is our joint work on memorization with Ricardo, who's joining as an assistant professor at the University of Toronto, Department of Statistics, if I'm not wrong, and Professor Andrew Stewart at Caltech. So we've done some work on memorization and regularization. This paper is currently under review at JMLR. So these are the 3 main references for today's talk. So if any of you are interested in any of this and cannot access the preprints, please let me know. I'd be happy to share them. Now, just to give a little bit of context, so what are generative models, right? And the best way to understand what generative models are is to give you an example. And the example is as follows. So consider that you have these sort of images of material microstructures. Now you're interested in synthesizing new images of material microstructures. So any mechanism that allows you to do that is a generative model. Effectively, what a generative model does is it learns the underlying data generation process. So you see this underlying probability distribution. Usually that is not known. A generative model's task is to estimate that and then allow you to draw samples from that. Now, this estimation might be explicit. For example, in the case of normalizing flows, where you can go and actually evaluate the density, or it might be implicit, where generating samples is a lot easier than sort of being able to actually estimate the density. And diffusion models certainly fall into the latter category. Now, the way the diffusion models work, and some of you may be very familiar with this sort of construct, is that given an image, right? So in this case, I'm showing on the left-hand side that I've written as x sub 0 is an image of a tumor spheroid, which is a collection of tumor cells. So the way the diffusion model works is that you add noise to it. So you have a forward process where you're progressively adding noise to it such that you structure of the image. So it becomes really a random sample drawn from a really high dimensional Gaussian distribution on the right, which I'm indexing as x sub capital T. And the diffusion model learns to remove the noise gradually from this noisy sample. Right? So that is in effect what a diffusion model is. So when you go in this forward direction, the way you're adding noise is something that you use for training. And we're going to look into all of this in more detail. And when you're going in the left-hand side direction, which is when you're starting from this noisy image, the diffusion model gradually removes noise to finally yield a realization from the desired target distribution. Now, this is a very high-level picture of how diffusion models work. But the goal of today's talk is to take a PDE-based perspective on this forward process and write down PDEs from this reverse process. Now, diffusion models have slowly emerging as really popular generative modeling tools, and they've been applied in very many applications. Now, I'm showing a very select few applications here. For example, I've seen diffusion models being used for protein synthesis. I've seen diffusion models being used for topology optimization. I've seen diffusion models being used for statistical downscaling. I'm sorry for the typo here. It's not upscaling, it's downscaling, but I've seen diffusion models being used for statistical downscaling. I've certainly seen diffusion models being used for turbulence research, and more, as I said, we're really interested in using diffusion models for solving inverse problems. So you're going to see some examples from that. So what is, in effect, any generative model, not just diffusion models? If you peel off the cover, what does a generative model do? So you can think of a generative model as a map between your target density and some reference density or distribution, with the reference distribution being something that is so simple that you can sample very easily from it. And then the generative model's goal or the role is to transform these samples back into samples from this target density that might be very difficult to generate samples from inherently. Now, a piece of nomenclature, this process of converting the target density to the reference density, we're going to call that the forward process. And this task of converting realizations from the reference density, which can be easily generated, back to the target density, is what we are going to call the reverse process. Now, as the name might suggest, the way a diffusion model works is by setting up a diffusion process or a diffusion PDE over the density of the target distribution. So if you look on the left-hand side, you'll see this sort of bimodal distribution, which is your target distribution. So I'm going to index it by time. So P sub 0 is going to be my initial distribution. I'm going to set up a diffusion PDE, as you can see here, which is going to act on this, right? So for a positive, so you have a positive diffusion coefficient, so it's going to act on this. And eventually, if you write down the Green's function and you write down the solution, you will see that it will get turned into this sort of unimodal Gaussian distribution. Now, as we know that the unimodal Gaussian distribution is something that we can generate samples from very easily, right? So this connection, so this forward process that you're looking at is nothing but a diffusion PDE, for which you can write down the Green's function. So the Green's function becomes the Gaussian kernel. Now, this diffusion coefficient, so gamma of t, if that is monotonically increasing or even constant or positive constant, then you can see that the variance of sigma squared of t also keeps on increasing. And therefore, these processes in the literature, in the diffusion literature, are popularly known as various exploding processes. Now, that's slightly undesirable because, if your variance keeps on increasing to a large quantity, you get very large values, right? So from a machine learning perspective, our goal is almost always to sort of normalize the data so that the gradients are, well sort of conditioned and so on and so forth. So this is somewhat undesirable. Turns out, if you scale the coordinates, so if you write x of t as some psi of t, so some time-dependent scaling, and times q, where q is, you can think sort of from the structural dynamics literature, sort of these generalized coordinates. So these are the rescale coordinates. Then you can write in closed form expression the PDE that governs this density P sub T of Q, not of X, but of Q. Now, we enforce two constraints on psi. The first being the psi of 0 is 1. So the scaling starts from 1. And for large time, as time t goes to capital T, you want the scaling to be almost equal, or the scaling divided by sigma, you want this limit to go to 1. And so we can write down expressions of what this C looks like as a function of sigma. I'll come to that in the next slide. But for now, if you look very carefully, you can write this sort of unified PDE. Now this PDE has a transient term, it has an advective term, and a diffusion term. So it's one of those very fundamental advection diffusion type of reactions, right? So you have a diffusion coefficient, and you have this sort of advective terms and its corresponding coefficient sitting in front of it. Now, because we have rescaled the coordinates, so at time, at very large time, right? So P sub capital T of Q is nothing but the standard normal distribution. And so you'll have values, or 95% of your values will be between, I don't know, between minus and plus 2.5 or something. So, your values are not large, they're not crazy, and your variance at very large times is sort of fixed. It's fixed to 1, or it converges to 1. Now, what can we say more about psi? So as I said, there are two conditions on psi. So psi of 0 should be 1. Oops. Can you still see my screen? No, I think not. Okay, so psi of 0 should be 1. And then psi of t divided by sigma of t for large time t should converge to 1. So one of the ways in which you can parameterize psi
The screen sharing stopped, right?
Yes, I think your screen sharing has stopped.
Now is okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. So the way you can parameterize psi is you can raise psi to the power mu equals 1 plus sigma to the power mu. And you can verify that time t equals to 0, when sigma of t equals to 0, you can psi of t equals 1. And for large times capital T, you can see that sigma will be a very large value, so psi divided by sigma will also converge to 1. It turns out that for this process, you can also write the Green's function. And the Green's function again is the Gaussian kernel, except this time the initial condition is multiplied by m of t, and sigma is not the sigma we wrote before, it's sigma hat. So sigma hat is sort of appropriately attenuated, appropriately scaled, such that for large time t that goes to 1. But it's still, as I said, a Gaussian kernel, right? So it's still the sort of the advection diffusion reaction. So the Green's function is still the Gaussian kernel. Now it's convenient to introduce a new parameter beta, which is equals to 2 times psi dot by c, right? And you'll see that when we write the unified PDE, so we'll write one PDE, right, which has two terms. Again, as I said, it has the advective term and the diffusion term. So you can write this unified PDE to describe both the variance exploding process and the variance preserving process. What are the differences? So for the variance exploding process, as I explained, as t goes to infinity or t goes to a large value, your sigma of t keeps on increasing, right? So if gamma is a positive quantity or gamma is some monotonically increasing function, sigma of t keeps on increasing. That's why it's called variance exploding. Whereas for the variance preserving process, that is not the case. For large time t, sigma of t converges to 1. That's why it's called the variance preserving process. Now, in the standard literature, this mu value is set to 2 usually. But as it turns out, and as I showed here, you can work with other values of mu as long as they're greater than 0. Right? So in effect, you can introduce a whole family of diffusion models, not just the variance exploding, but the variance preserving, but a whole family of diffusion models, right? For which you can describe the forward process. So you are not constrained to just 2 diffusion models, although in this table I've shown 2 because these are the 2 popular ones. Now, it is important that we introduce a new concept here. So if you look carefully at these Green's function here, so P of t conditional 0, so it's telling you what is the probability distribution or the probability law at time t equal t, small t, conditioned on the initial condition. So the initial condition in fixed is given by x of 0. So this is the Green's function. So if you look at it carefully, I can introduce a new quantity here, which is known as the score function. So if you take the gradient of the log of this, it turns out that is a well-known quantity. And the reason I introduce this will become apparent in the following slides. So just keep in mind that the score function is the gradient of the log density. Now, the score function has some interesting properties. So if you look at the figure on the right, you'll see that I've drawn this sort of bimodal distribution. So it's just a mixture of two Gaussians. And you can plot what the score function is going to look like. It turns out that in 2D, the score function is like a vector field with a vector arrow sort of pointing towards the direction of the fastest increase in the log density, right? Or if it were negative, sort of, if you put a minus sign in front of it, you can think of it as this sort of, plateau or this sort of valley with the arrow sort of pointing towards where the valley is. Now, another interesting property of the score function is that if you look at the gradient of the density, you can express it as the product of the score function and the density itself. It's a simple calculus and simple sort of juggling of terms, but this is something that's usually helpful and will be helpful when we make derivations in subsequent slides. Now, we've defined what the forward process looks like. So all we have to do is define what the reverse process looks like, right? And for that, we'll introduce a change in variables. So we'll introduce tau, which is capital T minus T. So at t equals to 0, right? So over here on the left-hand side, tau is capital T. And at t equals capital T, which is here over on the right-hand side, tau is 0, right? So that marching back in t, so as you go from t equals, as you go from t equals capital T to 0, you're actually going from tau equals 0 to capital T. So you can write down the PDE for that as well. So you start out by writing the PDE, you introduce this change of variables, and then you substitute the PDE from here. So you substitute this unified PDE back. And wherever you see a T, you appropriately change it to tau. But the interesting thing is that we can make adjustments to this diffusion term. So you see here, it is minus GT by 2. So we can add and subtract an alpha GT by 2. And then we're going to play a trick. So you see how there's a diffusion term here. So you can play a trick where you can change this diffusion term and absorb it back into the advective term. And so that gives sort of a generalized PDE describing the reverse process. It turns out that if you move away from this sort of density-based picture where you're operating on the density and look at the particles instead, you can write down a reverse SDE, or just an SDE for the reverse process, an SDE being a stochastic differential equation, right? Where you have this drift coefficient and you have this diffusion coefficient. And you can use any standard sort of ODE solver or SDE solver like the Euler-Maruyama method to actually solve this, with initial conditions taken from this unimodal Gaussian distribution. What that unimodal Gaussian distribution is will depend on whatever you have chosen for mu and whatever process you're working with, for example, the variance preserving or the variance exporting process. So depending on what G of T and B of T are, you are going to choose what your initial condition is. And if you have access to the score function, and if you solve this as SDE, you will come back to this initial condition. So you'll get back realizations from your target distribution. Now, the cool thing about this sort of, reverse process is that there are two possibilities. In fact, there's an entire continuum of possibilities. But let's say if you choose alpha equals to 0, you drop the diffusion term. And what you're left with is just the ODE. Right? So this term, this diffusion term, this term with the diffusion coefficient in your SDE goes away if alpha equals 0, and you're only left with an ODE. And if you actually solve it, and if you look at the figure here, the ODE path is shown in this light blue. And this ODE is often called the probability flow ODE. So you start with So if you start with a particle from your reference distribution, so you start with that initial condition, and you solve the ODE, you will arrive at your final condition, at your terminal condition, and that will be a realization from your target distribution. Whereas if you set alpha equals to 1, you will retain the SDE. You can indeed solve the SDE, as I said, using the Euler-Maruyama method, but you will not take like a well-defined sort of straight path or a smooth path. You will, have jiggles in your path as you go back because due to this diffusion term, but you will ultimately arrive at a realization at a particle from your target distribution. So the reverse process, again, as you see, is not just one process, rather it's an entire continuum depending on what value of alpha you choose. So to summarize, your B of T and G of T sort of describe the forward process. And what value of alpha you choose sort of defines your reverse process. But the key to all of this is this score function. And really that, as I said, is the key, or rather the most fundamental thing about diffusion models. You see, you don't have access to this score function. So we will set up a way in which we can learn the score function. And really that is what diffusion models are all about. Now, the score function itself, right, is grad log p sub t of x, as I said, right? So you can write the score function of any distribution. The score function that appeared before is nothing but the grad log of the density of the time evolving density. So we'll parameterize that with a neural network that accepts as input x and t, right? So as you can see, p has two sort of arguments, x and t. So those will be my inputs to the neural network, and my neural network will spit out this sort of grad log p. The thing to keep in mind is that this grad log, the score function is a vector value function, which has the same dimensionality as x, right? And when you're actually implementing this, the one good thing to keep in mind is that you just don't enter the scalar value of t. You rather embed time that can be a learnable embedding or sort of a fixed embedding, and use that as an input, not just a t that goes from 0 to 1 or anything like that. Now, to learn this network, you can set up a loss function, right? So we need that. So how do you set it up? So you say, okay, this is my score function. I want it to approximate the score function that I want, or of this time evolving density. So I'm going to minimize the 2 norm of that, and then I'm going to average it out over all time. So that's one of the integrals here. And then I'm also going to average it out over the entire density. Now, you don't have access to grad log p of t. So that you don't have access to that. But what you do have access to, as I showed in a couple of slides ago, is that you have access to grad log pt conditioned on the initial condition. And so you can expand this loss function. So I'm not going to go into the details of that, but you can expand this loss function. You can get this this other loss function where you have this first term, which has these parameters theta that you're trying to minimize. So these would be the parameters of the neural network. And you get 2 other terms which are not dependent on theta. So we can ignore them. And finally, whatever you're left with, you can approximate it in a Monte Carlo sense. And that would give you your final loss function. So in going from this denoising score matching to the Monte Carlo approximation, what I've done is multiplied by sigma t. So that's why this disappears from the numerator and appears, disappears from the denominator and appears in the numerator here in front of s sub theta. And is z because the relationship between x and x0 is simply that x of t is x0 plus z times sigma of t. So one of those sigmas gets cancelled from the denominator, and what you're left with is z of I, where z of I is sampled from the standard normal distribution. So if you look carefully at this loss function, what is the score function really doing? So the score function is taking as input x raised to the power I, which is nothing but the noisy version of x0. It is taking time as an input. And we are asking the score function to predict how much noise we added to the image. So effectively, the score function looks at a noisy version of the image. So if you go back to the first image that I showed you, it looks at a noisy version of the image and it learns to predict how much noise it was added. And so, and if you look at this, just this ODE coming backwards, so what is it doing? So it's looking at this noisy version and then predicting how much noise you added. You remove that noise. It looks at the noisy version again, predicts how much noise is there, remove that noise. And you take these small steps backward, each time removing some amount of noise to ultimately arrive at a particle from your target distribution. That is all what this loss function is about. Now, for those of you who have worked with GANs and normalizing flows or even autoencoders and other sort of generative models, this loss function has some advantages that I should sort of make explicit. The first thing is that just by looking at it, you can see it's like a regression type of loss function, right? So, it's just a 2 norm. There's nothing sort of, it's not like a GAN, it's not like a min-max, so it's incredibly stable to train. And secondly, this score function doesn't need to be invertible. It's a vector valued function. It doesn't have to be invertible. So you can work with, lots of different architectures. So unlike normalizing flows, you're not constrained to just working with invertible architectures. So although very capable, these diffusion models, their memory footprints are not as large as normalizing flows would be. Now, as I promised, so we'll look at a certain application in inverse problems. Now, where this gets interesting in terms of the inverse problem is that, firstly, there are many ways in which you can solve an inverse problem, where the goal is to recover x conditioned on y, meaning that you've made some observation y, which I'm writing as y, right? And you want to infer what x is. Now, you can set it up as an optimization problem. You can certainly solve it, but we are more interested in sort of looking at Bayesian inference, which invokes the Bayes principle, which tells you that the posterior distribution, so a distribution of x conditioned on y, is proportional to the likelihood, so to the prediction y conditioned on x, and some prior. Right? So there are two things now. So there's not just x, there's also y. So the diffusion model, as you'd guess, right, will have to take in both x and y, and it will take in pairs of this data of x and y. So I'm showing the joint distribution in green here, right? And it'll try and predict sort of the conditional distribution. When you make an observation y hat, we'll try and predict, or rather sample, this conditional distribution, right? Now, that is what we are going to do, but why do it with diffusion models? Well, because solving an inverse problem or applying Bayesian inference or doing Bayesian inference is an inherently computationally challenging task. First things first, so if you look at this example that I've shown on the left here, you'll see that these measurements, are measurements of displacement, and this x, which is this quantity that you would infer, is the spatial distribution of the Young's modulus. Now, to describe, things like tumor spheroids, which are collection of tumor cells, which is what this image shows, you would need very complex priors. And really writing them down with analytically tractable priors is very, very difficult. So sort of the recent trend, or sort of the more modern paradigm, is to develop these data-driven priors, where your prior is sort of described by data, sort of implicitly described by data, and not by sort of analytically tractable priors, things like Gaussian mixture models or Gaussian processes, and so on and so forth. So diffusion models will allow you to sort of handle data-driven priors. Secondly, this relationship between x and y is given by a forward model, and the forward model itself might be a black box solver. And the reason that is important is because in very high dimensions, sort of vanilla Markov chain Monte Carlo methods don't work. You need some gradient-based MCMC methods, and getting the gradients with black box models is very difficult. And as I said, that is a challenge that is sort of follows from high dimensionality. And then finally, the cool thing is that if you can sort of, if you learn from the joints, if you learn some aspects of this green sort of distribution, then it doesn't matter what value of y you observe or what measurements you make. Your cost is amortized, and so you can reuse your diffusion model for different values of y. So this is particularly useful in very high throughput scenarios, as you'd expect in manufacturing and other applications, right? So to sort of gain all these advantages, we are going to use diffusion models to solve inverse problems, where the goal is to approximate the posterior using the joint data, or to sample from the posterior using joint data. Joint data meaning realizations of both x and y. Now, as it turns out, all the work we did before are for conditional diffusion models, but you can easily extend them to conditional diffusion models, where now the density is of x is expressed, or this time evolving densities is not of just x, but rather x conditioned on y. So the stuff you want to infer conditioned on the observations y. So you can write down the forward process, and you can similarly write down the reverse process as well, where the score function now takes in both t, x, and y. Right? So earlier it was just x and t. Now you've introduced y as well. And really the score function is we want is that of the time evolving density of x conditioned on y. So you can set up a similar loss function, right? But now there's one more integral, because you also want to sort of marginalize over y. So you want to like make this estimation across different values of y as well. You can simplify it as before. You get a term that doesn't depend on theta and a term that does, which you can compute and estimate using Monte Carlo approximation. Again, look at what's happening. We add nothing to y, so there's no noise added to y. We only add noise to x. So the score function takes as input this noisy version of x, the actual measurement or the corresponding value of y that was made from the not noisy version of x. It takes in time and learns to predict how much noise was added. So the conditional version of the diffusion model is a direct extension of the unconditional version. So let's look at an example, right? So we've been talking about sort of these advection diffusion reactions. So let's look at an example of an inverse problem from this advection diffusion reaction. So the problem setup is follows. You have this sort of a channel. You have these points where flux enters into the channel. You have this velocity profile on the left here, and you have appropriate boundary conditions. And we have these black dots, which represent sensors where we're going to measure the concentration. And the goal really is to infer the flux given the concentration. So X would be the flux, and Y would be the concentration measurements made at these different sensors. So there are 30 different sensors and 30 different flux measurements. However, the flux only enters in the left-hand side, towards the left-hand side of the channel, not towards the right-hand side. So there's no flux entering towards the right. However, sensor measurements are made along the length of the channel. Right? So the training data for this looks as follows. Right? So you actually solve this advection diffusion reaction for different values of the flux, and you actually solve it using Phoenix. You measure this, measure the concentration at different sensors, and then you add noise to it. And so you can see here, if you look carefully, so I'm showing two instances of the training data. So the top two plots here on the right are the fluxes. So these would be your X. So there are 30 different values. And then you have corresponding sensor readings. Now you will see that parts of the sensor reading are just removed. So we want to simulate a scenario where some of these sensors are faulty and do not work. And the way we do that is that we normalize the sensor readings that are actually made between 0 and 1 and set to -1 the missing values. Okay, so these are two instances of the training data. So we take this training data, we actually train the diffusion model, and then ask it to perform inference. So these are two different test cases, with the green line showing the truth and the black line showing the posterior mean, and the sort of the gray region showing the standard deviation around it. And you can see, or what you would want is this for the standard deviation to encompass the true solution to the green solution in most cases. Now, in this case, the problem is really, really ill-posed. So it does a good job sometimes, but not always. It does a good job towards the center and towards the end, where there's no more flux and you have this sort of cumulative effect present. So your system has evolved, or whatever the flow is happening has evolved sufficiently where it's not changing rapidly, so inference is quite possible. Whereas towards the beginning, where a lot of stuff is being put in, and there are very few lagging measurements made before that, there's more errors on the left hand side. But we do this for different cases of, or different configurations of sensors, meaning that some sensors are working and some are not. And we can still infer what the flux is from these concentration measurements. One thing to note, the noise that was added here is also additive Gaussian, but we have looked at other cases where we can handle noise with heavier tails, and we can handle cases where the prior even is sort of not a Gaussian process. So the prior in this case for the flux is a Gaussian process, so meaning there's some correlation, but you can simulate cases where there's no correlation as well. Now these two plots here show the performance in terms of the error and the standard deviation with increasing amount of noise. So you can see even at zero noise, which I know theoretically doesn't make a lot of sense, because what do you mean by zero noise and then solving an inverse problem? But we did that just to show how ill-conditioned the problem is by default, right? So the different colors on the left and the right show different segments. So I'm showing only segments 1 and 5 and 16 and 20, which are the leftmost segments at the bottom wall and the top wall, and the corresponding standard deviation. So what happens is that it's more of a sanity check, is that as you keep on increasing the amount of noise, you can see that the error is increasing, and also the posterior standard deviation around each prediction is also increasing. And this is averaged over 1,000 different test cases, right? So that slowly, as you keep on increasing noise, if your measurements are too noisy, the inference doesn't help. You go and strike the prior variance in these quantities. So beyond this, if you added noise, the inference really doesn't help. Now, this is a more of a synthetic example, but a more interesting example is this one, as I've been saying, for tumor spheroids, where the inverse problem is as follows. So you have these tumor spheroids, which are spatially varying Young's modulus, right? So on the left-hand side, so you can see, the different colors represent the tumor cells, and each of these tumor cells have different Young moduli. And this specimen is slowly compressed. And as it is compressed, at a particular level of compression, light is scattered back. And depending on the phase difference of this light, so, whatever the light which was scattered back at the beginning of the experiment and towards the end of the experiment, you look at the phase difference. It turns out that this phase difference encodes information regarding the displacement. So the inverse problem is to infer the spatial distribution of the Young's modulus from this noisy, phase field. Again, the training data is as follows. So you have these pairs of Young's moduli field and corresponding pairs of noisy phase difference fields. You take all of this training data and you train the diffusion model. So you first train the diffusion model and then you sample from it. Now, this is sort of a validation test, which shows the performance of the diffusion model on two cases which are synthetic. Okay, so you can see that the diffusion model does really well in these cases. But what is interesting is that you can also use actual measurements that have been made in an experiment. So this result that I'm showing you, these phase fields were actually recorded in a lab. So these are not synthetic. And you can feed that into your diffusion model and start up the sampling process, get lots of realizations from the posterior and use that to compute the posterior mean and the posterior pixel-wise standard deviation. And you can see, obviously we don't have access to the ground truth here, but you can see that, you can actually locate where these tumor spheroids are. So we can locate that, and we can also locate, sort of these regions of really high or dense Young's modulus, right? So you can co-locate those regions from the bright field image. But you can see that the variance is quite high, it's quite, sort of quite large because, whatever the noise is in the experimental measurements or, whatever the forward physics is, it's not perfectly elastic and so on and so forth. So some of that modeling error sort of creeps in, and what you see here is sort of that. So you can see really a large amount of variance, but this is still good. And I cannot sort of understate this because the state of the art in this is sort of algebraic inversion, and you get negative values of Young's modulus, which you'll have to clip. So you'll see holes in when you predict. So compared to that, this is really a great result. And this is what the sampling process looks like. So you start out from these noisy images, which are realizations from a high dimensional Gaussian distribution. And slowly but surely, as you go into the sampling process, your diffusion model learns to remove the noise, and you arrive at 4 independent realizations from the posterior distribution. Right? So if you actually plotted out the image, this is what the movie would look like for this particular measurement case. Now, the thing to note here, and before I move on to the last part of my talk, and I hope I'm doing good on time, is that even for this very simple problem, well, simple in the sense that this is 512 by 512 dimensional, and you're inferring the Young's modulus from inverse problem. The inverse problem is not really that ill-posed or whatever. You really need a lot of training data to actually train your diffusion model. So it's about, for this particular problem, we use 25,000 different sort of these samples of training data to actually train the diffusion model. So an interesting question to ask is, what would happen if we train the diffusion model with small amounts of training data? Because there will be scenarios where we can't generate this large amounts of training data necessary to actually train a diffusion model. And that leads to an interesting phenomenon that you will come across, which is known as memorization. So effectively what happens is that the diffusion model learns to reproduce the training data that has been used to train it. That is, in effect, what memorization stands for. And there are plenty of examples from the literature where people have come across, these sort of this sort of phenomena when they've used diffusion models. These are some, particularly sort of glaring examples of that I've shown here in this slide. Now, effectively, this problem starts from the fact that we are not working with the true distribution, but rather we are working with its empirical approximation. So like I said, the way to approximate the loss function is through Monte Carlo. The problem is that the moment you do that, you are no longer working with a continuous distribution, right? So what I have done is I've replaced the distribution with its empirical objective, and I've substituted that in the loss function. So whereas previously this loss function had an integral, it now has a summation, and the summation is over all I, and this I indexes all the training data that is there in your training set, right? So if you look carefully at the loss function, and you used calculus of variations, and you try to derive what a stationary point is, you would be able to do that. That's a fairly simple problem to do, right? It turns out that the optimal score function looks as follows. So it is minus 1 by sigma square of t, x minus these weights that are dependent on time, and it's the convex hull of all the training data. So it's like a Gaussian mixture model, right? So it's like the score function of a Gaussian mixture model where each of your mixture components are sitting on this training data. And the width of those mixture components is controlled by sigma. So as you'd imagine, when you're starting sampling, when sigma is large, it's a haze of the points. So you really cannot differentiate across the points. You rather, it is the mean, it is this entire cluster of points that is attracting X. Whereas when you're closer to t equals 0, right, when sigma is approaching 0, it is only one of these points in your training data that is going to attract the particle that you're integrating back, because it's the well-known and sort of well-studied weight collapse problem, right? So one of these weights will dominate, the rest of the weights will die out, and whichever weight dominate, that point is going to attract the particle that you're integrating backwards. So effectively, what happens is as follows. So let us look carefully at this picture. So this black line here is the score function of a Gaussian distribution from which we have sampled these red training data. However, the optimal score function is this blue line for some value of sigma. If you go towards t equals to 0, the more you go towards t equals to 0, this blue line becomes this orange line. This sort of takes on this sawtooth kind of behavior. So effectively, what you're trying to do, the problem that you're set up of score matching, is trying to approximate something that is as smooth as this back line with these sawtooth kind of things. So it is precisely the singularity that leads to sort of, the phenomena of memorization. Mind you, that as sigma t goes to 0, these sawtooth kind of things are going to get more and more sharper till sigma t is actually 0, right? So in which case these will be like just disconnected and really singular. So you'll see that singularity when t goes to 0. Right. So we can do some reparameterizations. So we'll do two of them. First, we'll write down S as minus half of log sigma squared t. So this is a rescaling in time, so that as t goes from capital T to 0, S goes from S0 to infinity. So going backwards in time is going like forwards in S and going all the way to infinity. Right? And then finally, also in this reparameterized time, we're going to write y of S is x of t of x. So the reason we do this is because it just helps us write down a very simplified ODE, which is dy ds. So dy dt is like dy ds equals negative of y minus the summation wi x0i. We're going to write that as y sub n. Now, if you actually solve this ODE, so you start out from an initial condition and actually solve this ODE with the optimal score function, the trajectories of the particles coming backwards, as I said, will get pulled towards your training data. So if you start at all of them, so this is a particular case where your training data is sort of shown with these blue dots. So they come from a sort of a uniform Gaussian sort of standard normal distribution in 2D. So you start out with these particles from far away and you're integrating them backwards. They will always converge to these training data points. Okay, so this is a phenomena that you will see if you use the optimal score function. So based on this observation, this is joint work with Ricardo and Professor Stewart. So they're brilliant mathematicians. So we've been able to come up with a statement that we can make regarding the long-term behavior of these diffusion models. So we'll need to define some things before we do that, before we make the statement of the theorem. The first thing is the compact set of the Voronoi boundaries. So B of 0R is a ball of radius r that encompasses all of the training data. And this dV essentially denotes all of these Voronoi boundaries. So if you don't know what Voronoi boundaries are, so if you're on this black line here, you're then equidistant from the two nearby training data points. So that is what those Voronoi boundaries represent. So if you take that, then it says that as you keep on integrating backwards, or as you keep on going forwards in S, so as you're sort of integrating the particles, that if y star is a limit point, right, of this sort of dynamical system, then the final solution will converge, or the dynamical system will converge onto this limit point as k goes to infinity. So you have an increasing sequence of S, means that you're keeping on going forward. So you will converge to this limit point. The main theorem states that if there is a limit point, and we know that there is a limit point, then that limit point is either one of these training data points, whichever one is closest to the trajectory, or these Voronoi boundaries. So if after a certain point you are on the Voronoi boundary, you will remain on the Voronoi boundary. If, however, you're not on the Voronoi boundary and you're inside one of these Voronoi cells, you will be drawn to the training data point that is in that corresponding Voronoi cell. Now we can show a simplified case with these two data points. So what you have is these red dots showing these two training data points. You start with initial conditions on the boundary of this rectangle, and you evolve the reverse process. So the Voronoi boundary is the straight line partitioning this space into two equal halves. So if you're on this Voronoi boundary, you will stay in this Voronoi boundary forever. You'll never leave it. However, if you're not on this Voronoi boundary, you will get drawn to these red points. And so that is what memorization in a sense is, and that is exactly what happens. However, there are some saving graces, right? The fact that we don't use the optimal score function, but we rather try and learn that with a neural network, which, by the way, is it's a very difficult job to actually sort of use a neural network and try and model something like sawtoothy and something as irregular as this. So the neural network approximation to the score function lends some degree of regularity by itself. So if you don't train the neural networks for that long, and I'm showing here the fraction of samples matching data, you will see very small amount of memorization. However, if you train the neural network for very large amounts of time, you will actually see memorization to a fair extent. Similarly, if you use a fairly incapable neural network, meaning that you use a smallish neural network with a small number of parameters, and you compare it with another neural network that is really over-parameterized, then for the same amount of training, you will see less memorization in the under-parameterized network, whereas more memorization in the over-parameterized network. Now, unfortunately, it's very hard to make statements about the degree of memorization with respect to the capacity of the network or the amount of training that you expect. So one of the ways that we've explicitly tried to tackle memorization is by adding a regularization term on the score function itself. So you can add a Tikhonov kind of term, and where C is your regularization strength. So you just augment the loss function that you had, the score matching loss function that you had with this Tikhonov term. And it turns out that as you keep on increasing the strength of the regularization, you will see that the points don't come back to the, so these particles, they don't come back to the training data points, and you see sort of this more of a smudge behavior. Right? And so as you keep on increasing your regularization parameter, your sort of amount of memorization drops. And it's interesting to actually look at what happens to the score function. So on your left, if you look at this plot, you can see that your optimal score sort of blows up, but your neural network doesn't. Even for a very small amount of regularization, there is a significant departure over here. So the x-axis, I think, is time, and this is score function taken at a particular point. So as t goes to 0, so this score function, the optimal score function, blows up, whereas the neural network doesn't. And the more and more you increase the regularization, the more sort of deviation you see from that blow up. And so therefore, the lower the memorization. Now, why did we talk about all of this? So why are we interested in settings where there's not as much amount of data? And one thing I've shown is that memorization is something that can happen there. But we're interested in the settings because we're interested in doing data assimilation with with sort of conditional generative algorithms, right? Now, data assimilation is sort of an extension to the inverse problem that I showed you, where all the data arrives at once, right? So you have the entire measurement of the phase field. But there are more interesting problems, in particular, that arise in structural health monitoring and many other fields, in numerical weather prediction and so on and so forth, where data arrives in periodic intervals, and at every time the data arrives, you're required to sort of update the current state of the system. And in that case, if you want to make so in that case, if you want to make if you want to perform data assimilation rather efficiently, you cannot do that with a large ensemble size. You have to do that with a small ensemble size. And that's why we're really interested in applying these conditional generative algorithms in sort of these data limited settings. And so a lot of our ongoing efforts are sort of guided by that, where we are interested in finding out ways in which we can develop what are known as multi-fidelity generative algorithms that can use models of different fidelity, data that is different cost of generation, to learn and model, figuring out different ways by which we can update these models, and how if we can apply, essentially trying to answer the question, how we can apply or leverage these generative models in really data constrained settings. And so that brings me sort of to to the end of my talk. There's a long list of people I'd like to thank. Like I said, our work on memorization is a joint work with Ricardo and Professor Andrew Stewart from Caltech. A lot of the data for the tumor spheroid example has been provided to us by our collaborators from the University of Western Australia. Funding for this research comes from the ARO and NIH. And I also want to acknowledge the Von Neumann Fellowship from Sandia, although none of the work I presented here was carried out at Sandia. All of this work was carried out at USC, hence my background, I guess. And that's it. And any opinions that I've expressed today are solely my opinion, do not express the opinions of either my funding agencies or the United States government. And on the right-hand side, I've left sort of these QR codes to the papers, to the primary references for this talk. Thank you. And again, I'd like to thank the organizers for having me today. It was really fun, and I hope that you have had a fun seminar as well.
Thank you, Dr. Dasgupta, for this wonderful introduction and a detailed presentation on your work. So from the audience, I have some questions, but let me first go to the audience. So from the audience, if there is any question, you can raise your hand. Yeah, Dibyajyoti, you can go ahead.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you for the wonderful talk, Dr. Dasgupta. So I had a question regarding the inverse problem that you have solved. So can you comment on the uniqueness of the solution when you are solving an inverse problem? Like, do you think that multiple solutions may exist when you're doing the...
Yeah, for both problems, right? Like I said, for this problem, it is inherently ill-conditioned. So multiple solutions can exist and multiple solutions will exist. And even for this problem, so effectively going from a displacement field to the Young's modulus field is an ill-conditioned problem. So you can have different, especially if the displacement field is noisy, you can have different strain states and that are compatible. And then from corresponding to those different compatible strain states, you can have different Young's moduli fields. So you will have multiple solutions. And that's why you want to do Bayesian inference, so that you can quantify or characterize all these possible solutions under the posterior.
I see, I see. So let's say, for example, you have a Darcy PD and you want to approximate the permeability. So uh, so then the approach which you have, like the Bayesian inference approach, is basically approximate a posterior distribution, and then maybe you could report the map estimate or something like that. Is that the general procedure that you follow?
Yes. I mean, yes. I mean, what estimate you can report depends on obviously the character of the posterior. If it's generally multimodal, even the map makes sense, the mean won't. And so, the map estimate makes sense. However, quantifying or finding out the map just from an ensemble of realizations is very difficult. Usually the map estimate, you have to do something else to find the map. And so people will report the mean, but for a general multimodal distribution, even the mean is not a correct estimator. So, there are nuances there. But in this case, we have found that the mean is useful and it's not completely useless. And so we reported the mean.
So let's say in the case of a simulated data, usually since we are simulating the data, we might fix the system parameter of some value. So if you go by this route, you a priori know that there is one specific value of the parameter, let's say viscosity or something, which you expect the model to give you back when you're solving the inverse problem. So
no, yes and no. I mean, that's the quantity you want to infer, right? Let's say viscosity is the quantity you want to infer. So in that case, what you would do is you'd fit a prior. So you'll do lots of simulations with different values of viscosity, right? And you'll set up your training data. You'll train your diffusion model. Then let's say you've made an observation for which you don't know what the viscosity is, right?
True.
And in that case, you'll refer to the viscosity. In fact, if you look at this experimental results that I showed you, we don't know what the Young's modulus field looks like. We have this bright field image, which is not measuring the Young's modulus. This image here on the left is not measuring the Young's modulus, but rather it's measuring the density. So the only thing we can say is that we've got the position correct. We can say nothing about the quality of this mean in terms of how accurate that is. That's why we validate on synthetic data first and then apply it to experimental data. The hope being that there's a successful transfer there.
Yeah. Okay, got it. Thank you.
Any other questions from the audience? Yeah, go ahead. While
Thank you, Agnimitra, for the talk. I had a few questions about the different parts of the work you presented. So regarding the first part, the PDE interpretation of diffusion models, I'm trying to situate your work within the generative model literature. And obviously the link between the SDE and the PDE is always there with the Fokker-Planck equation.
Yeah.
What would you say is your contribution within that work? Is it more the unified representation of
I think so.
various variants?
Yeah, you're right. So people have hinted at this connection of sort of, well, let me put it this way. If you look at the diffusion modeling literature, a lot of the language there is to do with SDEs. So even the forward process and the reverse process, everything is written down in terms of the SDE. And you're correct. There is a connection through the Fokker-Planck there. I've seen very little work actually sort of doing that for diffusion models particularly. There was a paper out of NVIDIA, Terracarsis paper on, I think it's called Elucidating the Design Space of Diffusion Models, where in the appendix, they do write down the diffusion PDE, but they do that only for the variance exploring process, not for the variance preserving process. So really our main contribution here is to unify all of that with this unified PDE, then also reveal that you can have this whole continuum of samplers and this continuum of order processes that you can get. You're not just sort of, beholden to either working with either the variance exploring or the variance preserving process, but rather you can sort of choose what process to work with in between all of that. And to do that effectively in the language of PDEs and not sort of take a recourse to SDs or anything like that, unless you have to work with the sampler, which is where we did, but at least for the forward process. So I think that's our unique contribution here.
Got it. Thank you. And then a follow-up question regarding the second part of the talk on the conditional generation. So obviously, like what you showed, were you following something like classifier-free guidance approaches?
No. So no, this is not classifier-free guidance. So effectively, in the classifier-free guidance, your score function is still the unconditional score function, right? But here we train the score function for the conditional distribution. So you see the score function here that approximates, or that is trained to approximate the score function of the conditional distribution amortized over the marginal of y. In classifier-free guidance, you would still have a score function, but that would be the score function corresponding to the prior. In your classifier guidance term, effectively models the score function of the likelihood. So the way to do that, to look at that, is that if you write down the score function of the posterior, you can write it as the additive, two additive term, or rather you can do an additive decomposition. So in terms of the score function of the likelihood and the score function of the prior. So what you describe classifier-free guidance or classifier guidance is essentially you have an unconditional diffusion model approximating the score function of the prior, and then you sort of somehow approximate the score function of the likelihood. That is an entirely different approach.
Okay. I'm actually curious to hear your thoughts on this. Essentially, when would you opt to use a prior trained diffusion model within like a more Bayesian infinite setting versus training a conditional diffusion model like what you have?
If you have additive Gaussian noise, this score function of the likelihood can be written down easily, and if you can approximate the gradients, or if you can take gradients to your black box model or whatever your forward model is, then you can, if you have access to the likelihood in a sense, then you can use that. So you don't have to use a classifier, because for us computational models and the gradients through that will be enough. So you can do that. But unfortunately, in many cases, you won't know what the likelihood is. And so taking gradients of the score function or taking the score function will require gradients that you will not be able to compute. So in that case, I would use what I just showed. The advantage being that there's no need for taking gradients and that sort of thing through your computational model.
Got it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any other questions from the audience? If not, I have one or two very quick questions. So in the first part of the talk, right, you presented the PDE perspective on diffusion. And there was this interesting parameter, or at least I found it interesting, was the alpha parameter. Where alpha goes to 0, it becomes the PDE, where you can deterministically go from one sample to another. And then if alpha has some value, non-zero, then it's basically an SDE, right? And you have to use some Euler-Moriyama or basically stochastic calculus you have to use for sampling. So when alpha equal to 0, and you are getting a deterministic map, right, from one point to another, does it have any relation with flow matching? I mean, because it's also getting a deterministic map, right?
Yeah, I mean, flow matching. So I would put it this way: diffusion model is a particular type of flow matching. So even if flow matching is sort of more more general paradigm. It comes in many flavors. One of them is diffusion model. You have stochastic interpolance and so on and so forth, right? But the idea there is also similar. So you will have a reverse probability flow ODE, right? And for flow matching models, you would learn this entire velocity field, not the score function in particular, but rather you would learn this entire velocity field. Okay. You can also come up with an SDE for your flow matching models, right? It's hard, not as straightforward, but you can do it. Okay. So when you say flow matching, I say diffusion model is a type of flow matching. So just something to keep in mind.
Okay. Okay. Sounds good. The other thing, and it's a small question. So you mentioned, right, data-driven prior that we use nowadays. So when you say data-driven prior, right, I mean, ideally priors would be based on your prior belief. But when you say data-driven, I'm in my mind, it is like historical data. I mean, that's the only data that, in my opinion, would be on the prior, at least on paper. I mean, there are priors which are based on actual data. I mean, the same data used for training. But when you were mentioning this data-driven prior, you mean historical data or the same data that you'll use for training?
This is, I mean, you will use data that's available, could be historical, could be from experiments that you have conducted to build, to actually, construct your training data, right? So you will take realizations from this prior, propagate them through the forward model, which involves, invoking the physics-based solver and adding some noise and yada, 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 and then you'll get pairs of this X and Y. So pairs of X meaning the data, as I said, and Y meaning the corresponding observations. So that is how you sort of build your training data set.
Okay. Okay, but it can be separate also, right? I mean,
it can.
The data that I use to build the prior can be separate from the one that I use for, let's say,
absolutely.
The likelihood.
The point is that do you even want to go through this exercise of building the prior, right? So once you have data that you would traditionally use to build a prior, right? Would you even bother building a prior in that case? So let's say in this example, you have images of these tumor spheroids that are historically available, let's say from Banks of patients. Why would you go through the exercise of building a prior? You would just propagate them through your forward model, get the corresponding measurements, and train a diffusion model with that, and let the prior be whatever it is, right? It's implicit in whatever data you've collected before.
Yeah, but if I have enough data, which is 25,000 in your case, but if I have less data and if I have some prior knowledge, I might want to use that, right? Which will act as a regularizer, which you are anyway doing later. So in that case,
whatever I'm saying, I'll say in the assumption that there's lots of data. So you're
I understand that. I understand that, but yeah, I was thinking something else. But anyways, yeah, that's all from my end. So let me ask one more time if there is any question from the audience. If not, thank you again for this wonderful talk and for giving us time for this and speaking in this seminar series. And for the audience, thank you for joining in. Next week, we have another follow-up talk by Professor Elias City. So do join us for that. Thank you and see you next week. Thank you, Dr. Dasgupta.